Karl Marx. Okay, it's a name we all know. You've heard it right. Maybe as an insult, maybe as a joke, maybe as a rallying cry. But who was the actual guy? What did he really see that led him to write these ideas that literally changed the world? Let's get into it.
Right off the bat, you run into this huge problem. On the one hand, you've got people saying his ideas are just a straight line to tyranny. But on the other, you have people calling him one of the most brilliant economic minds, period. So, how can both of those things be true?
And that really is the big question we're tackling here. Who was the real Karl Marx? We're going to try to peel back the layers, separate the man from the myth, the scholar from the political ghost that still haunts us today.
To get Marx's ideas, you can't just start with the books. You have to start with the world he was looking at. And it wasn't some abstract thought experiment. It was a gritty, brutal, in-your-face reality. So let's take a little trip. Our first stop is Manchester, England, in the 1840s, a place his partner, Friedrich Engels, basically described as a guided tour through hell.
Engels is our tour guide here. So picture this. You're walking along the River Irk in Manchester. The bank is super steep, and houses are just jammed in there. We're talking 3 rows deep, built with absolutely no plan. The ones at the bottom are practically in the river. It's not a city. It's just chaos.
And as you go deeper into the alleyways between these houses, it gets so much worse. Engels talks about seeing a shared toilet with no door, so disgusting that people literally had to walk through pools of human waste just to get in and out of their own homes. And this wasn't some rare thing. This was daily life. And that river I mentioned? Well, Engels says it doesn't really flow. It just sits there. It's black with coal dust, it stinks, it's full of garbage and waste from the factories. He even describes bubbles of what he calls miasmatic gas constantly coming up from the bottom. This is the air they're breathing. This is the water their homes are built on.
So, if living there was a nightmare, working there was just as bad. I mean, just look at this list. We're talking 12-hour days minimum for almost no money. And that's not just for adults. Kids, little kids were working those same hours. You had no rights, unions were totally illegal. The work was so backbreaking that people developed physical deformities. Engels said you couldn't walk down the street without seeing someone crippled by their job. And by the time you hit 40, you were basically used up. Done.
So here's the absolute key to understanding them. For Marx and Engels, this wasn't just poverty. They saw it as a brand new kind of slavery. They even called it wage slavery. They put it on the same moral level as chattel slavery in America, arguing that these workers had no real freedom. They were just cogs in a machine. And their whole project became about abolishing this kind of slavery. But just being horrified by all this, that wasn't enough for Marx. He wasn't just an activist. He wanted to be a scientist. He genuinely believed he could figure out the fundamental laws of motion that controlled human history, like a doctor diagnosing an illness to find a cure. That search became his life's work. So, who was this guy, really? Well, you might picture some revolutionary on the barricades, but the reality was pretty different. He was born in Prussia, got kicked out of multiple countries for his radical ideas, and ended up in London. And what did he do there? He spent decades, day after day, in the reading room of the British Museum, just reading and writing his masterpiece, Das Kapital. He was a scholar, often broke, trying to build a massive theory from the ground up. But he was a scholar with a very clear mission. And this quote? This is probably his most famous line, and it's basically his entire philosophy in one sentence. He's saying, look, it's great to understand how the world works, but that's not the goal. The whole point of gaining knowledge, for him, was to give people the tools to actually change the world.
Okay, so what were these tools? His first big idea was something called historical materialism. The theory goes like this. Think of society like a building. The foundation, the base, is the economy, how stuff gets made and who owns it. Everything else, your government, your laws, your culture, even your ideas, is the superstructure built on top of that foundation. You want to change the building, you got to change the foundation.
So if the economy is the foundation, what makes it change over time? For Marx, the answer was simple: class conflict. He argued that all of human history is really the story of a struggle between the small group that owns the means of production, the land, the factories, the tools, and the much larger group that has nothing to sell but their own labor. And this leads us right to the heart of his attack on capitalism: surplus value. He asked a really basic question: where does profit actually come from? His answer? A worker, he said, produces more value in a day's work than they get paid for in wages. That gap, that leftover bit of unpaid work, is the surplus value, And that, Marx claimed, is where all profit comes from. To him, it was the scientific formula for exploitation.
So when you put all those pieces together, Marx believed he had found a predictable pattern, a kind of roadmap for history. You start with feudalism, that's landowners versus serfs. That conflict gives way to capitalism, which is the bourgeoisie, the owners, versus the proletariat, the workers. He predicted that conflict would inevitably lead to a revolution. After that, a temporary state he called the dictatorship of the proletariat would manage the transition to the final stage, communism, a society with no classes, no state, and no more exploitation.
Now, as we all know, history didn't quite follow Marx's script. But that doesn't mean his ideas faded away. Far from it. They cast an unbelievably long shadow over the 20th century, creating a legacy that's every bit as complicated and controversial as the man himself.
Which leads to a really interesting thought experiment people kick around online. What if Karl Marx had never been born? Would history have played out completely differently?
Well, most people seem to think that while Marx was one of a kind, his ideas were sort of in the air. The socialist movement was already happening. For sure, his partner Engels would be way more famous. Other socialist theories might have become more popular. And other thinkers, like this guy Dietzgen, were already coming up with very similar ideas on their own. So the movement probably would have existed, just maybe without that one unifying scientific-sounding theory that gave it so much power. The Cold War could have looked totally different.
But of course, in our history, Marx's ideas did not stay in books. Their impact on the real world was just explosive. It starts with Russia in 1917, and then boom! By the mid-century, interpretations of his work, mainly Marxism-Leninism, became the official state ideology for a massive chunk of the planet, defining the entire global conflict for decades.
And that brings us right back to today. The world of Manchester that Marx saw, with open sewage and child labor, it feels like ancient history. And most of the big communist states are gone. So you could ask, is Marx just over? Is he irrelevant? Are his questions about capital, about labor, about inequality, are those just dusty old historical debates? Or, in our modern world of gig work, automation, and massive wealth gaps, are those questions actually more relevant than they've ever been?